Ever get chills listening to that iconic Twilight Zone theme music?
Yeah, it's so eerie, right?
Well, imagine actually being on the set of Twilight Zone, the
Yeah.
movie. Like you're about to be part of that magic.
I'd be thrilled.
But then it turns into a total nightmare.
Oh, you're talking about the accident?
Yeah, July 23rd, 1982. That night changed Hollywood forever.
Definitely a dark day in film history.
It's not just about what happened, though. It's about why. Why did three people die in that set?
I think a lot of it comes down to ambition, maybe even a bit of recklessness.
That's what we're going to deep dive into today, those decisions and how they forced Hollywood to face some really tough questions.
And the sources you've dug up, they provide a fascinating look at this whole tragedy.
So first, who was the man at the center of it all?
Yeah.
John Landis. He wasn't a Hollywood kid, but he was captivated by it.
Oh, yeah. One of your sources even mentions him as a kid being completely mesmerized by the seventh voyage of Sinbad.
Sounds like that movie planted a seed for him.
Like a fascination with visual storytelling.
Yeah, I think so. And that turned into pure ambition. He starts as a mailboy at 20th Century Fox, just 20 years old.
Wow, hustling to break in.
And just a year later, he'd made his first feature film, Schlock.
Schlock! Huh. Not exactly a household name.
It wasn't a masterpiece, but it shows his willingness to experiment even on a tiny budget.
Did he really wear the gorilla suit himself?
He did. Total dedication. But it was Animal House a few years later that really launched his career.
Oh, Animal House. That's a classic.
It was huge, defined a whole era of comedy.
And solidified Landis as a director who could make hits, right?
Absolutely. But he also earned a reputation for being demanding on set, always pushing for perfection.
I've heard stories around that time. Didn't he become friends with another up-and-coming director, Steven Spielberg?
Yep, that's right.
So you've got these two young, ambitious guys both pushing each other, making cameos in each other's films.
A friendly rivalry, but a rivalry nonetheless.
A rivalry that would end up deeply connected to this Twilight Zone tragedy.
So how did they end up tackling a project like the Twilight Zone? What drew them to it?
Well, in 1981, Warner Bros. Wanted to bring the Twilight Zone, the TV series, to the big screen.
Reimagining the classic.
Yeah. But with 4 different directors, each doing their own segment, anthology style.
I can see the appeal for a director.
Total creative freedom, right?
Ugh.
Landis and Spielberg were on board immediately, along with 2 other directors.
Sounds like a recipe for something amazing, but we know it went very wrong.
Yeah, and a lot of that stemmed from the choices Landis made for his segment. He chose a story that was tough to film. Night shoots, tons of special effects, and children.
Child actors, yeah, that's where things get really complicated.
Big time. His segment had a helicopter flying low over water, explosions,
Sounds intense.
and he had 2 young kids in the scene with veteran actor Vic Morrow. Micah Dinley was 7, and Renee Shinnie Chen was 6.
Just reading that, you can sense the danger.
Right. It wasn't just dangerous, though. It was straight up illegal.
The production broke California's child labor laws. These kids worked way past the legal hours for minors.
And their parents didn't know the full story.
That report you shared goes into detail about permits they never got, things they lied to the parents about. Really makes you question a director's responsibility, especially when you're dealing with children.
Absolutely. They chose their creative vision over the safety of those kids.
So let's talk about that night, July 23rd, 1982. What was it like on set as they prepared to film?
Imagine, it's 2:00 a.m., way past when those kids should be working. Micah and Renee are woken up, brought to the set.
Sleepy kids, late at night.
Their parents, thinking it's safe, are watching from a distance.
This doesn't sound good.
The helicopter's ready, the explosions are wired, and Vic Morrow, with the children in his arms, is standing in the riverbed. Action.
It's almost like they were tempting fate.
As they filmed, the tension just kept building. The helicopter swooped low, explosions went off, chaos everywhere.
Like something out of an action movie.
But this was real life. And Landis, wanting it to be even more realistic, he's on a bullhorn telling the pilot to fly lower, get closer to the action.
Pushing it too far.
And then it happened. One of the explosions, too close to the helicopter, it damaged the tail rotor.
Oh, no.
The helicopter spun out of control, crashed into the river, right on Morrow and the kids.
It's hard to even imagine the horror.
It was a horrific scene. Vic Morrow and Micah were decapitated on impact, and Renee was crushed under the wreckage. The set went silent. All you could hear were the screams of the parents. They saw everything.
Oh, my God. What did Landis do? How did he react?
He was shaken, clearly. He dismissed the crew for the night.
I can't imagine processing something like that.
There are accounts in your sources describing him in shock, just unable to grasp what had just happened. But this was just the beginning. Now, the big question was, who was responsible for this?
Yeah, that's what we'll have to dive into next time.
I mean, the whole thing was just chaos. After the accident. The shock, the grief, the confusion. Just trying to figure out how something like that could even happen on a Hollywood set.
It's truly mind-boggling. And amidst all of that, the investigation started. What did they find?
Well, they uncovered a lot of failures, safety protocols that were completely ignored, miscommunication between the crew members, and a director who, well, he seemed to put his vision ahead of everyone's safety.
So this wasn't just some kind of freak accident. It sounds more like it was inevitable.
Yeah, that's the sense I get too. And one of the things that really stood out, the production didn't have the right permits to film with minors.
Right. We mentioned those laws earlier.
And they didn't have a qualified special effects coordinator either. Someone with the experience to handle a scene like that.
It's a stark reminder that even in a place like Hollywood, rules still matter. Real-world consequences.
Totally. So, California law at the time said kids under 6 couldn't work at all. And for kids between 6 and 18, they needed special permits and had strict limits on their work hours, especially at night.
And Micah and Renee were working past those limits.
Way past. And their parent, they were kept in the dark about what was really going on.
Deception on top of everything else. What about the film? Did the production shut down after the accident?
Well, Landis and Spielberg, the two main directors, had very different reactions. Spielberg, understandably, he was completely devastated. One of your sources even mentions he wanted to scrap the whole project.
I can only imagine. How do you even think about continuing a movie after that?
Exactly. But eventually they convinced him to finish his segment, though he changed it completely. He actually scrapped his initial idea, which also had child actors and night shoots.
Wow. So even Spielberg, who is known for his grand visions, realized safety had to come first.
Yeah. Really says something about him, how he responded to the tragedy. Landis, though, he chose to salvage his segment, re-edited it, cut out the scenes with the kids, focused on other parts.
I wonder what audiences thought when the movie came out.
Well, Twilight Zone, the movie was finally released in June of 1983. But the reviews were mixed, It was hard to ignore what had happened, and a lot of critics and viewers, they just couldn't separate the film from the accident.
I bet it was a weird, somber experience for everyone. And beyond the film itself, didn't the accident really impact the relationship between Landis and Spielberg?
It created a huge rift, for sure. They never worked together again, and Spielberg was very vocal in his criticism of what he called the cult of the director in Hollywood.
Cult of the director? What do you mean by that?
He was basically talking about this dangerous dynamic on film sets where directors are given so much power, crew members might be afraid to speak up if they see something unsafe. He felt this kind of cult of personality could lead to safety concerns being brushed aside.
So he was advocating for a more collaborative approach, where everyone prioritizes safety.
Exactly. He saw the Twilight Zone accident as a wake-up call for the entire industry. And he used his influence to encourage crew members to speak up if they felt something was wrong, no matter who was in charge.
A powerful message. But the story doesn't end there, right? Because there was still the question of legal accountability. Who was responsible for those deaths?
Right. In 1986, they finally filed criminal charges. John Landis and 3 other crew members, the associate producer, the production manager, and the special effects coordinator.
So they were facing actual legal consequences. This wasn't just about Hollywood pointing fingers.
It was a huge turning point, not just for those involved, but for Hollywood in general. The trial that followed, it really exposed how things work behind the scenes in the film industry. It forced everyone to look at safety practices in a whole new light.
I bet that trial was incredibly tough, especially for the victims' families.
It was brutal. They had to relive that night, listen to the details of their loved ones' deaths over and over again. The families of Vic Morrow, Micah Din Lee, and Renee Sheeny Chen, they were there the whole time. You could feel their pain, their anger. Their testimonies were heartbreaking, really brought home the human cost of this whole tragedy.
What were the main arguments in the trial from the prosecution and the defense?
Well, the trial started in May of 1986 and went on for 9 months. The prosecution argued that Landis and his team had completely disregarded safety, knowingly breaking child labor laws, and not taking proper precautions for such a risky scene.
What was Landis's defense? Did he take responsibility for anything?
Landis and his lawyers, they maintained that it was just a terrible accident, a freak occurrence. They said all the safety measures were in place and that the explosion that brought down the helicopter, that was just an anomaly.
Blaming it on something they couldn't control.
That's how it came across, yeah. But the prosecution, they presented evidence that crew members had voiced safety concerns before the accident, concerns that Landis allegedly ignored. They painted him as a director so fixated on his vision, he just overlooked or dismissed any potential risks.
So it's a tough job for the jury.
It was a complex case, no easy answers, but after months of deliberation, they reached a verdict.
So what did they decide?
On May 30th, 1987, the verdict was not guilty. Landis and the others, they were acquitted on all charges.
Wow, not guilty. What a shock. But even if he didn't face criminal charges, did the trial have any lasting impact on Hollywood?
Absolutely. That trial, you could argue, was a turning point for the industry. It forced them to confront their lax safety practices, acknowledge that ignoring those practices could have serious consequences.
I mean, after everything that came out, the violation of those laws, it's hard to believe they were found not guilty.
Yeah, a lot of people were outraged. They felt like the justice system failed, like those responsible for the deaths, they got away with it.
But the jury, they decided the prosecution just didn't prove their case.
Right. So legally, it was over. But did it change anything in Hollywood?
That's the question, right? Did this tragedy lead to any real change?
Oh, absolutely. The Twilight Zone trial was a watershed moment.
In what way?
It forced Hollywood to look in the mirror, to see how lax their safety practices were.
And how dangerous that could be.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about admitting there was a problem. It was about taking action to prevent another tragedy.
So what happened? What kind of changes came out of this?
Well, after the trial, a bunch of organizations stepped up. The Directors Guild of America, the Screen Actors Guild, even the California Fire Marshal. They all implemented stricter safety regulations for film sets.
What were some of the big changes?
They tackled a bunch of issues, but the most important ones were working hours for minors, pyrotechnics, safety, and better communication on set.
So for child actors, there were clearer rules about permits, making sure their hours were limited and their parents were informed.
Right, no more loopholes like what happened on the Twilight Zone. And with pyrotechnics, they implemented stricter protocols, made sure qualified experts were always on set.
Sounds like they really wanted to make sure this never happened again.
Yeah, they were definitely trying to learn from the mistakes of the past. They also emphasized communication, making sure everyone on set could speak up if they saw something unsafe.
That's crucial.
Yeah, the goal was to create a culture where safety came first, no matter what.
It's just so sad that it took such a horrible event to make these changes happen.
It is a bittersweet legacy. Those regulations couldn't bring back the lives lost, but they did make things safer for future productions. Hopefully, something like this will never happen again.
We've talked a lot about Hollywood, but what about the families of the victims? How did they deal with the aftermath of the trial?
It must have been devastating for them. I mean, Landis and the others were acquitted, but the families did sue them in civil court, and they ended up receiving millions in settlements.
But no amount of money can truly make up for a loss like that.
Yeah.
Especially when it could have been prevented.
It's true, and it's important to remember that these weren't just names in a headline. They were real people with families, dreams, and their lives were cut tragically short.
It's easy to forget that sometimes.
Vic Mara's daughter, Jennifer Jason Leigh, she was only 19 when it happened. Imagine going through something like that.
Horrible. So as we wrap up our deep dive into this tragedy, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all of this?
The Twilight Zone accident, it's a cautionary tale. It reminds us that every film set, every production has a responsibility for safety. It's not just about following the rules. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels comfortable speaking up, questioning things, and putting safety first. No movie, no shot, no vision is worth a life.
Absolutely. And for our listener who's been so engaged with this topic, what's something they could explore further?
It would be interesting for them to look at how this event, beyond the immediate changes, might have influenced the long-term safety practices in Hollywood and maybe even other industries where there's a lot of risk involved.
That's a great point. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It sparked a wider conversation about safety and responsibility.
And that conversation's still going on today, We're still dealing with issues of power in the workplace, holding those in charge accountable, and encouraging everyone to speak up when they see something wrong.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Twilight Zone accident. We hope you found it insightful and that it's given you something to think about.
I agree. Thanks for joining us.
And as always, thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.